Good afternoon. Welcome to NUFC Matters, your second dose of NUFC Matters. Today, following on from Ross Gregory, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Ben Jacobs. How are you, Ben?
Good afternoon, and very well. You?
Very good, mate. Very good. Always good to see you and chew the fat about Newcastle United and football in general with you. And Rafa Benitez, there's a name we haven't heard from for quite a while, has given a rather open and candid interview with some great content about not just Everton and Chelsea, but also Newcastle United. And I guess the undertones you can find in this interview won't surprise Newcastle fans. Rafa Benitez basically telling everybody they endured a frustrating time in charge of Newcastle United. And I found it really good. I'm not going to take too much away from the interviews. People can tune in and watch them themselves. But yeah, what did you make of it, Ben? I know you've had time to catch up on the sound bites.
Well, I think the first thing from Newcastle's perspective is it's clear that Benitez sees the new ownership group and himself as a bit of a passing ships situation or a lost opportunity. And were things different? And Amanda Staveley had managed to get the club earlier. And remember, she tried on more than one occasion to buy Newcastle United before being successful. Then I think that Rafa Benitez would have been brought back to Newcastle and he may have followed a different path. But he went to Everton. And I think it was clear from the interview that he gave that he feels internally at Everton, and to some extent with the fan base as well, who didn't take too warmly to him, it was quite tough to change the culture of that football club. And obviously Benitez was quite happy to go to Chelsea as well, where on the field he did okay, more than okay, in fact, and still the fan base were reasonably frosty towards him. And this is what Benitez does. He backs himself. He's not afraid to go into big jobs or difficult jobs. But Everton just didn't go as smoothly as he would have hoped. And he's been very frank about that. And I think that it's clear with Benitez, and we saw this when he worked under Mike Ashley as well, that he needs that ability to, one, like any manager, have funding, but two, to have that authority. And I don't think that he wants absolute authority. I think he's quite prepared to work within a model or a system. And he's an experienced enough manager now that he's been with enough different coaches and models to be able to adapt. But I think the feeling at Everton was that he was just too handcuffed. And the feeling also towards the end of his tenure at Newcastle was relatively similar as well. So this, for me, shows that Benitez is quite reflective, quite humble, quite accepting of some of his own errors, and at the same time, just wasn't at the right stage or fit, maybe, to make Everton work. And I always find that really intriguing, because with a player, when they go from one rival club to another, we sometimes say that it will never work. And although there's exceptions, the fan backlash with a footballer when they move can be very tough to overcome. And with a manager, we don't always see that. People will point to one or two examples, of course, but I think that a lot of the Chelsea fans, although they never warmed to Benitez, still had to appreciate that he got some success at that football club, like him or loathe him. And obviously the most famous example when they were fierce rivals was Brian Clough, when he walked into Leeds United, and it just never worked. But generally speaking, there isn't as much of a niggle, as much of an issue about necessarily a manager crossing sides comparative to a player. And I think the reason for that is because it just doesn't happen that often. I'll be very interested, by the way, to see whether, if Everton comes up now and Brendan Rodgers becomes available, whether he's prepared to walk into Everton. But we know that it can be difficult. We know that it can be tough to change the culture. And what we've learned from this Benitez interview is it's not just about that fan base not wanting a manager with other, for want of a better word, allegiances. We also learn that internally it's quite hard to change the culture and the business of a football club if you've kind of got that backstory. And I think that some executives at Everton, if Benitez was perhaps citing the Liverpool way, were not particularly happy about that because they wanted a point of differentiation between how their football club operated and run, but even extending through to the style of football. And that was part, coupled with, to some extent, the funding as well, based on what Benitez has said anyway, as to why it didn't work. But coming back to Newcastle, I think the most interesting thing, you'll know better than me, Steve, is just, again, that relationship between Staveley and Benitez. And if everything had gone according to plan on Amanda's original aspirations and roadmap for buying Newcastle United, she'd have loved to bring Rafa back. That's certainly my understanding, but I'm sure you'll know a lot better than me on that one. But I think that that's the missed opportunity. If Benitez looks now, and with all due respect to Eddie Howe, Newcastle have gone in a completely different direction, and Benitez was ultimately not available when they chose to bring in Eddie Howe. But if you flash back and you put the takeover perhaps on a different, faster roadmap, or even if you go a little bit earlier down the line when Amanda was still looking for investors, there's been a few windows where she could have brought Benitez back to the football club. And I think that if you only put it down to Amanda and things had panned out on a timescale that was a lot different, my understanding anyway is that Benitez would have always been the number one choice to come back to Newcastle United, at least if she took 100% of the say.
Yeah, you're 100% right. That was the original plan. But as you say, things didn't happen as they hoped, as quickly as they hoped. And yeah, it worked well for Eddie Howe. Some good questions coming in. And I'm going to combine these two. Tom Dixon says, do you think Benitez will get another job in the future? And Ian says, does Ben fancy Rafa for Leicester? Now, obviously, Ben Rodgers is going through a bit of a bad time at the minute at Leicester. And one would imagine that the owners will eventually have to make a decision, or Rodgers may fall on his sword. Who knows? But would you fancy Rafa Benitez at Leicester?
Well, I think that with Rodgers, there's still some consultation going on as to what the best approach is. It's very difficult if they want to sack him because they'll owe Brendan the best part of 10 million. So if the club wish to move him on, they'll be hoping almost for a favour and a mutual consent, which might reduce the payment owed to Brendan Rodgers. And Leicester have got a reasonably kind run of fixtures now coming up where they'll have an opportunity to pick up some points. So the international break is going to be reasonably key, I think, as far as Leicester's board are concerned. Do they move now and bring in somebody quickly, or do they say to Brendan Rodgers that you've got a derby against Forest, you've got a away trip against Bournemouth, you've got a home game against Crystal Palace, you've got Leeds, you've got Wolves, all coming up before we get towards the end of October, and then things get a little bit harder. And within that context, there's a chance for Leicester to certainly get themselves out of the relegation zone. And if they can string together 2 or 3 wins, we're still at that stage of the season where they could easily find themselves in the top half of the table. And despite their woeful starts of the season and poor defending, if you look at Forest and Bournemouth and Palace and Leeds, Leicester will be thinking they can get 10 points from those games as not necessarily a minimum, but a very realistic goal. 3 wins and a draw, go on a 4-game unbeaten run, and then everyone's thinking about things this season very differently. But the challenge is that the fans, probably more so than the players, have already kind of at large given up on Brendan Rodgers. They feel that it isn't just about this season. So outside of Leicester, you could say, well, they've not been able to spend. He's a good coach with a great pedigree. He's only ever finished in the top half with Leicester. And if you look at the financial woes and Wesley Fofana departing, can he be blamed? And I think if you isolated it only for this summer, there's definitely some things that are out of his control. And then if you add the errors, which are more on the player's shoulders, and he'll be as frustrated as anyone by them, you could definitely make an argument that he's not only to blame if you only took this summer out of context. But fans will look at the last 18 months and see more of a steady decline, and so will the board. And that's why I think it is time for a change. So then would Rafa Benitez be right for Leicester? Well, I think from Benitez's point of view, yes. And it's not the first time that he's been linked with Leicester either. And where's Leicester's problem? It's in their discipline. It's in their defensive organisation. And Benitez would certainly be the right kind of coach to help rectify that situation. Is it necessarily the style of football that Leicester fans would want? And would one or two players be conducive to that system? That remains to be seen. But I think that he would be one contender of many. And I know for a fact, by the way, that Benitez, when you say, will he work again, is definitely still interested in working. And Leicester would be one of the jobs that he would put his name in the hat for should a vacancy become available. But my personal opinion is that there's other candidates that either are available or might come to Leicester that would be a better fit. And that's not because I don't like Benitez. I think it's more because Leicester want to look long term. And at 62, Benitez is, I think, quite up to date. I think still quite a modern manager in a lot of ways, which is refreshing for someone his age. It's quite easy to think of him and say, you know what you're getting. But from what I understand, he's still quite science and data driven. And he's one of the few in that generation that has adapted his style and would do the same at Leicester too. But you've got Mauricio Pochettino, free agent. It would probably be a big ask for Leicester to attract him, but he might fancy it looking at Leicester's pedigree if he was guaranteed that this spending freeze will be alleviated over the coming window or two. Then you've got Sean Dyche, who I think is somebody that Leicester might turn to if they stick with Brendan for another month or two, and then they got to the halfway point of the season, the World Cup break, and then they find themselves in a perilous position. Maybe that's when you go for him. But the one name out of all of the, loosely speaking, candidates, if, and it is still an if, Brendan goes, that I would like is Thomas Frank. And that's the mould that Leicester's owners are looking for. Now, can they get him? And is there a possibility that Leicester's model is right for him? Because remember, he's in that kind of very unique, very data-led, very scientific, very collaborative model. And if he moved to Leicester, that's quite a big transition behind the scenes to work with this ownership group. And then if there's no money available at the same time, he might find things a little bit difficult. But if they could get him, his mentality, his attacking football, his man management, his coaching style, his ability to spot a gem out of nowhere and be part of the recruitment process, all fits into what Leicester needs. So Frank would be my number one choice, but I do know for a fact that if Brendan goes, then Rafa is interested for sure.
Okay, Ben, the media favourite, will be available soon. Mr. Bruce. No, not even Ben would want that. I wouldn't wish that on Ben either. Mr. Anderson, good afternoon. He says, does Ben know anything about this new Brazilian who has been said to be the next Neymar that we've been linked with? There were rumours we could in November because of his age or permit. I'm not 100% sure who that is. I know we were linked rather recently with Garang Kual, the young Australian A-League side. Central Coast Mariners have him on their books at the moment, and he's a highly rated 18-year-old. Talk about him coming stems, I guess, from his performance recently against Barcelona in May for like an All-Stars 11. So, yeah, I'm aware of him, but I'm not sure about this other player. Do you know anything about it?
I would imagine that the question is about Endrick, the 16-year-old Brazilian who's being hotly pursued by a number of clubs, including Barcelona and Chelsea as well. And this is certainly a talent that virtually everyone in world football thinks is going to explode onto the world scene. And the reason for that is because he's a striker who's shone at Brazil youth level and is now starting to creep into contention for senior selection at Palmeiras. He's a left-footed forward with a really accurate shot that's full of power and deftness. Obviously not always at the same time, but those two skills are quite rare in somebody so young. So sometimes the head goes down and the technique just allows the shot to be released very quickly with a very almost surprising amount of power that he can generate, even off a dead ball. And then at other times, he's just got that composure and intelligence that defy his age. And this is why he's drawn comparisons with the Brazilian Ronaldo. And for those of the slightly older generation, Romario as well. So what I think attracts a lot of clubs to his style is that usually some of these qualities that I've just outlined don't materialize until a later age. And when you're showing them off at the moment, when you're utilizing them to this degree at such a young age, and he's very physical. He's a fighting type of player. He's a persistent type of player. He pressures defenders from the front. These are all reasons why most people in the game think that Endrick is going to be a phenomenal talent. And then when you have clubs like Chelsea and Barcelona all either trying to get a signature out of him, or what's sometimes referred to as a pre-signature. In other words, you get either a first refusal or you have a contractual deal with the player that allows you to take them either now or at a slightly later age. And then they can have two options within the negotiation. They either continue their talks, and whilst those happen, you agree a kind of pre-contract, and then that allows continuation of development at Palmeiras, which for a teenager might be more beneficial to the family, or it flips the other way and you bring them over into the club youth development, and that requires a relocation. But then the family may say, well, after a year or two, we still want them loaned back again so they can complete their education, in this case in Brazil, and so on. So there can be quite difficult deals to negotiate. And as far as Newcastle are concerned, there's not a great deal in this, to be honest. The main clubs really pushing are Barcelona, number one, and then Chelsea have looked too. And Chelsea, by the way, are looking to do a lot of business in Brazil. They see that as a market as they develop this so-called multi-club model under Todd Boehly, that they can really benefit by having ties in both Portugal and Brazil, which tells you that the kind of youth that they want have that kind of flair, have that technique first, and they believe that they can bring more over to the Premier League at a younger age. And Arsenal obviously do that with a number of Brazilians under Edu as well. And then you've got Real Madrid and also Bayern that have looked at Endrick too, but neither of them have moved. And from Real's perspective, they're on record as saying something along the lines of they don't quite think he's ready just yet. So I think Newcastle are going to struggle at this point, unless, as I say, they go down that first negotiating route of trying to persuade the player to sign a pre-contract or a later contract, and then at the same time have him stay at Palmeiras for a little bit longer. But I think issue with a really young player who's only at 16, who's creeping into the first team setup, is that the sort of challenge almost can be that if you don't have a multi-club model, then you can be a bit caught out, because that is what sort of offers the stability. It offers the option to go through a pathway-based system. So it's quite kind of tough almost to persuade a player when you're only an entity and you don't have that fullback and you don't have that youth setup that allows regular game time, and you're moving continents and there's no guarantees. That's quite tough. Whereas, if you put him into a multi-club model like a City group, and they've shown some interest as well, that can become a bit easier, because there's different routes you can take to get game time. There's different staggered phases. So Newcastle United can't say to any young player at the moment when they're going to break into competitive football, whereas the City group and others with perhaps stronger relationships with clubs, whether they're official or unofficial, can offer you that. Well, at 16, you're just going to be part of our youth setup. And then at 18, you're going to be, let's say, at our sister club in MLS. And then at 21, you're going to go off to Australia. And then at that point, we'll hopefully have you in our first team squad. And I think that talking to parents of a 16-year-old, that's the real selling point from what I hear. And that's the part of Newcastle's business that might be the slowest to develop, because what PAF have done is they've got investment from the top down. So they're looking to create a first team that challenges and gets into Europe. And at the same time, they're looking to build a stadium and a fan experience and a training facility and a culture around the city of Newcastle, framed around the first team, that yields success. And that's great. And it's what you have to do to get Newcastle catching up with the so-called Big Six. But then after that, it'll be interesting to see if they inverse that And then how do they build from the bottom up to ensure these pathways for young and particularly foreign talent willing to maybe take a risk to come to Newcastle United over other clubs? And when they're going for a wonder kid at this point without European football, especially when they're a very young wonder kid, he's not 20, he's not around the first team at the moment. I think that's the challenge. And my understanding with Endrick, if that was what this question was about, is that Newcastle are not really in the conversation at this point.
Okay, that answers that question comprehensively. Lots of questions coming in. Diaby or Maddison, who's more realistic to join, says Matty, and Tom Dixon also asking about Maddison. Again, it's a name that just won't go away with regards to Newcastle United. And I guess people hoping that he would come across here in January, maybe.
I'd be surprised if Maddison joined Newcastle now. I think that the opportunity was there over the summer. Newcastle obviously chose not to raise their bid, and thus no serious conversation ever took place. And what Newcastle may struggle with is that unless results pick up, because the effectively mid-season break comes early due to the World Cup, if they're not in a position where European football looks likely, and James Maddison continues to be Leicester's best standout player, then he'll either know that there's other interest coming in January, or he can hold out until the summer, at which point I would be staggered if he replicates what he did last season, this season. And even though Leicester are rock bottom of the table, Maddison has still scored 3 Premier League goals in 6 games. So he's on pace for what he did last season. There will be a club with Champions League football, in my opinion, or certainly Europa League football, that will want James Maddison. And that's when Newcastle are going to struggle to persuade Maddison to join over, let's say, a Tottenham, unless in January or in a year's time, they're in a stronger position in the table. And this is the sort of paradox with Newcastle, that the players that they're looking at are, to some extent, not going to pick Newcastle until they achieve the success. And yet, ironically, Newcastle want those players to get that success. So they'll be basically saying to a James Maddison in January, if they're 10th, 11th, 12th in the table, you'll be the difference. And if you join, you'll get us that European football, and then everyone's happy. But Maddison may turn around in January and say, sorry, I believe that I can join somebody that's better placed in the table or that's guaranteed European football. And that's what he wants. So the Newcastle project is of some interest, but what was clear over the last summer is he didn't do a Wesley Fofana and try and force his way out the club. He was quite happy to stay at Leicester. He backs his own ability, and he's going to bide his time until I think he gets the right opportunity. And at the moment, I don't think that is Newcastle United. But if we get to January and they're not 10th in the table as of now, they're 4th in the table, or they've got that momentum from the back end of last season that looks like they're going to get Europe in their kind of first full swing season, if you like, with Eddie Howe, then that might change his line of thinking. But I just think the better Maddison does, the more it might persuade a Tottenham or even a Chelsea to come in for his signature. And from what I understand, if a big London club comes in, then Maddison would be ranking that one above Newcastle, not really because of the geography, but more just because he would like to walk straight into European football. So that puts quite an interesting dynamic on Maddison comparative to the summer, because over the summer, Newcastle could lure players with the momentum of last season. But now, if results continue, then you're looking at ultimately a draw, as we saw with Bournemouth, a draw with Palace. The loss to Liverpool was, of course, unlucky, but the draw with Wolves was equally as underwhelming. The draw with Brighton was battling, but it still wasn't 3 points. And they need to find a way of picking things up, because if they can get into January in another window with that momentum, it puts a different complexion on things. But if the next few results don't go their way in October, then people are going to start thinking Newcastle are mid-table. And that's not a bad thing, by the way, for Newcastle, but it's just a bad thing as far as Maddison and their January window is concerned. I think with Diaby, he's always been very open to the Newcastle move, but had said over the summer that he would do another full season with Leverkusen. That may change due to the level of interest. Again, Chelsea and Arsenal are one of a number of Premier League teams that are keeping across him. So they're two to watch, but I don't actually think, despite the hype and the excitement, that there's a high probability at this stage of either joining Newcastle in January. And I think the one to watch still remains Jack Harrison, who Newcastle were equally as keen on. Leeds didn't want to sell. They had no reason to sell because they'd obviously got the money from both Rafinha and Calvin Phillips. But I still believe that that one is a very realistic possibility. And we can start to look at the narrative of that one now rather than in January, because Leeds are intent to put a new deal down for Harrison. And a new deal doesn't mean a great deal. As we saw with Fofana, it can just protect the sell-on value. But if the player feels there's going to be a viable option, then they may not sign that new deal to facilitate their exit a little bit easier. So watch this space, because if Harrison signs a new deal at Leeds, then that could take him off the table because the price will be raised in January. But if he delays signing that new deal, there may be a window of opportunity for Newcastle to move over the coming months once we get to the window early next year.
Okay, great stuff. We will go to an ad break, give Ben time to get a quick drink, but we will be back after this. Big thank you to skipsandbins.com, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract, free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Thanks to Darren Baldwin Funerals, independent funeral directors. You can find them at 304 Old Durham Road, Gateshead. Telephone 0191 478 273, or email Darren at darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk, or go to the website darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk. Thanks to Garden of Healing Dispensary, CBD hemp and cannabinoid specialists. You can find them at thegohd.com. And thanks to 3 Property, who specialise in sourcing investment properties for their clients who are looking to invest in the Northeast. They offer a full in-house service from sourcing the deals to managing the properties for you. They've done over 100 plus deals in the past 12 months for clients all over the UK. Give the guys a follow on Instagram, matty.patter_northeast property and phil.reed_northeast property, or email phil@3property.co.uk if you're interested in getting a good property deal. Thanks also to Mr. Vicky's Sauces. They are handmade in Cumbria. You can find them at mrvickys.co.uk or give them a call on 01768 210 102. Thanks to Media Arts for all the help with the video technology side of things. And thanks to qtechshop.co.uk, the makers of pool tables and snooker tables in Wallsend, Newcastle, and the guys who run our website, NUFCmatters.com. If you want to subscribe to the channel, hit the NUFC Matters logo in the bottom right-hand corner and you can subscribe for free. Hit the thumb up underneath the video to like it. It does us a big favour. And click share to share to your social media, such as Facebook and Twitter. Maybe he's added to a Newcastle United group. You can also make a donation. Just hit the thanks button underneath if you're enjoying the content and you want to share something with me or the people on the channel. And you can also click join, which means that you commit to maybe a monthly membership, or you can become a cult member. How do you do that? Well, you go to the website, nufcmatters.com, and you search for membership. What do you get for your £25 one-off payment? You get a cup, a pen, a membership card, and a scarf, and entry into the monthly draw. We also have a smart code. There you go, the QR code there. If you put your smartphone over it, it'll take you straight to the website and you can get involved in a cult membership pack today. We also give you something for nothing. If you subscribe to the show, then email john@nufcmatters.com and get your free car window sticker now. We also support the food bank on here. nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk is the Matchday Bucket website. You just need to go there and you can make a virtual donation. Don't forget, during the season on match days, we're at the Dog and Parrot with Supermac, pre-match and post-match. And we're at Pumphrey's, John Anderson and John Gibson, pre-match only. Also got the Takeover anniversary party coming up at the Irish Centre. Tickets are £2 on the door, and you can get your tickets for that from nufcmatters.com. And Supermac will be at the Terrace Club in Seaton Delaval, Friday the 11th of November. Tickets are a tenner, table is £650. and you can get those tickets from 0191 237 0133. Back with Ben Jacobs now on NUFC Matters. Last half hour, get your questions in if you've got anything for him or anything you would like to know. Just quickly touch on the game of the weekend, Ben. A lot of animosity, and disappointment and, overreaction I felt on Twitter at the weekend. It's another point in the bag. It's the way I look at it. You mentioned something a little bit ago there about mid-table wouldn't be a disaster. Of course it wouldn't. Newcastle are, they made a massive U-turn since this time last year, and we really are at the start of something very special. But that's the key. We're at the start, and a minority of fans booing, overreaction, knee-jerk reaction on Twitter. It's all just it's all crazy. Something we've seen before, and it's something we'll see again, no doubt. Football fans are fickle, Ben, aren't they? Really, at times.
Yeah, and I think it's the kind of game where if Newcastle had the numbers for getting the result and to some extent even the quality of chances, but if they had 20 shots in a game, 75% odd possession, almost half of those shots I believe on target, and their passing accuracy was up about 90%, then 9 times out of 10 at St James's Park you'd expect to beat Bournemouth. And I think that is part of the frustration. They had a ton of corners, they controlled the game, and then you suddenly find that you go 1-0 down. But from there, I think that the positive for me remains that Newcastle, within 5 minutes of going down in a game, got a penalty and were 1-1, which is not a disaster. And Bournemouth have been okay since that 9-0 hammering to Liverpool that saw the departure of Scott Parker. They've dug in and they've got some results, and they've proven that they're no pushover. So the frustration really is a mixture, I think, of Newcastle just lacking that bit of cutting edge in front of goal, and at the same time, probably just fans viewing that starting 11 and the squad generally and thinking this type of game at home should be 3 points. And they're absolutely right in that respect, that St James's Park is supposed to be a fortress now. It's a great atmosphere, 12th man and woman in the fans. And if you look at how they played at home against Man City and how they elevated their quality and their energy into sort of hyperdrive, this felt a bit flat. And Newcastle actually have been a better side so far this season, win, lose or draw, against some of the bigger teams. And they've perhaps struggled against sides that play deeper and sit back and give them more of the ball. So they definitely need to find a solution to that. And only off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact starting lineup, but when you've got like a Pope and a Trippier and Byrne and Shah and Bruno and Willock if he's playing well and Isak up front and so on, and Joe Linton obviously, and Almiron had a great pre-season and is showing a lot more potential. When you've got those kind of players all starting, and then you look at Bournemouth and you see that their threat is in Billing, who scored, or Solanke, and you look at the back and you see Mepham and Senesi, I think it was, the two centre-backs. There should have been a real opportunity for Newcastle to score early and put that game to bed. But Bournemouth defended well, and Newcastle, with a lot of the ball, sort of ran into a lot of dead ends. They struggled to really cut through Bournemouth, particularly in central areas, but they still had 20 shots on goal. And I think if you repeat that game over and over again with, as I said before, 75% of the ball and 20 shots on goal, I think Newcastle will win those kind of games. And once they get that bit of confidence and they learn to unlock these more rigidly defensive teams, they'll find a way to turn 1 point into 3. And then the broader point is more just, how have they started the season at the moment? And do the fans see 10th place as good enough? And the first thing to say on that is Newcastle are 3 points off 6th place. That's number one. And I think that fans are in this kind of mold at the moment of judging the run rather than the bigger picture. So they're looking at perhaps Bournemouth drawn, Palace drawn, Liverpool lost, Wolves drawn, and then Tranmere was a win, but it was kind of laboured. And then Manchester City was one of the best games and performances of the season. And unfortunately, Newcastle only got a draw. And then obviously Brighton draw. So you have to go all the way back to Nottingham Forest at home, which was also quite a laboured win, as you might expect on opening game of the season against a newly promoted team. And maybe fans are just looking at all of that collectively and adding that or juxtaposing that against the momentum of the back end of last season and thinking it looks a bit underwhelming. We're struggling to score goals. We're lacking a little bit of momentum. We're not winning games that we should be. And the saving grace of all of that is if Newcastle are not quite at their best in every game at the moment, they're still, again, only 3 points off 6th place in Europa League football, with Fulham and Brentford to come. 2 very winnable games. So I think October is going to be very key because there's a few tests in there, like away at Manchester United and away at Tottenham. And it is naturally important that Newcastle build up towards the break before the World Cup with a little bit of momentum. But if this is Newcastle now, with a few new names gelling and not at their best and not perhaps as free scoring as fans would like them to be, then just think where they'll be when they are going to get going. And all these draws for me are games that certainly under the Mike Ashley era, Newcastle probably would have lost 1-0 or 2-1. And now they're fighting back from a 1-0 deficit against Bournemouth. They would have beaten Palace if VAR hadn't wrongly intervened. They were desperately unlucky not to get something from the Liverpool game. Again, they fought back away very late in the game at Wolves and so on. I won't go through the whole season, but the point is that there's still that pattern of Newcastle United picking up points away from home and not giving up on games. And if things had gone a little bit differently, they could have easily beaten or certainly drawn with Liverpool. They should have beaten Palace and they were done by VAR. And then, as I say, there's games like Bournemouth and Wolves where, okay, they didn't get all 3 points and they were underwhelming for some parts of the game, but they still battled back. So that, on paper at least, is a point gained. And I think that when you add all that up and you find the side 10th in the table and you juxtapose that obviously against how they started last season and the dire straits that they were in, I think it took 3 international breaks before Newcastle even got a victory. So this is okay. It's not spectacular. It's not kind of an absolute continuation of the momentum from the back end of last season. It's definitely not European form, but all in all, I think you take it as a building block, and now they need to find a run between now and when the World Cup break happens to elevate themselves from mid-table mediocrity to in the European football conversation. And the good news is that because we're so early in the season, that only takes a win or two. I mean, look at the table now and look at who they've got next. It is actually Fulham that are in 6th place, and they've had a great start to the season. So if Newcastle beat Fulham, then immediately there's a completely different complexion on the table. They could move above Liverpool. They could move above Chelsea. They could move above Fulham. They could actually be in a European spot. So those, I think, moaning about doom and gloom, perhaps looking at a 90 minutes or the last few 90 minutes, not the bigger picture. For me, apart from the fact it's just the 1 win in 7, Newcastle table-wise, squad-wise, chemistry-wise, unity-wise, fan base-wise, ownership-wise, spending-wise, they're exactly where they need to be.
Yeah, of course they are. And look, the form table over the last 46 games, Newcastle must be still ingrained in the top 4 or 5 because, we're still getting points. We're not losing games. And that's got to be a huge pointer for Eddie Howe. He's got to be happy with that. But look, what I loved about Eddie Howe, we'll park the Bournemouth game now, but what I loved about Eddie Howe was he came out and he was honest. It wasn't good enough as far as he was concerned, needs to find ways to change it. It's what you want to hear. You don't want to hear a manager come out and say that it was one thing when we all saw it was something else. And we've got other sides respect now. They're now coming to Newcastle and St James's Park and having to park the bus. Which is what they do to Man City, which is what they do to Liverpool, and now they're doing it in Newcastle. You take that as a compliment, but it's Eddie Howe's job. He gets paid the big bucks to find a way to break teams like Crystal Palace and Bournemouth down, and he has to do it, and that's the job that he gets to play. A lot of people asking about this, so we'll come to this. Tom says, Ben, what do you think of the FA Cup replays being scrapped in the 3rd and 4th round? League Cup either scrapped or elite clubs fielding under 21 sides and parachute payments being reduced in the Premier League. Lots to talk about there. John also asks about the cup replays potentially being scrapped to accommodate European football. Is it the tail wagging the dog, he says?
I don't like FA Cup replays being scrapped. I think the League Cup is one entity, and given a lot of the top clubs don't take it particularly seriously as far as their selection is concerned, or maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. They use it as an ability to squad rotate. That, with under 21 sides that are in Europe, makes a lot of sense. And I don't even think that you have to formalize that, because ultimately it's what a lot of teams are doing anyway. But of course, by formalizing it, you then force a team in Europe to enter in that capacity. And perhaps that opens the door to other clubs to challenge and win the League Cup. And as somebody that grew up in the 90s watching Leicester win League Cups, I can tell you that it's very special. It's a route into Europe. And maybe that will just put impetus on the Premier League clubs outside of Europe to take the League Cup more seriously. And then from those in Europe, we can start seeing some of their younger players get guaranteed opportunities. And if they go on a run and succeed, they won't suddenly get replaced when these bigger clubs make the quarterfinals, semi-finals and finals. So that part I don't mind. The FA Cup replay, I think, is part of the fun of the actual tournament. And to remove it from third round and fourth round, for me, isn't particularly right or fair. Because if you're a non-league club that's battled to the FA Cup third round and you get a home draw on a bumpy pitch and you play a team like Newcastle and you grind out a 1-1 draw, then you're off to St James's Park and you get twice the payday and you get that whole experience of playing at a Premier League ground. And vice versa, if you get the draw at the Premier League ground, you might end up dragging them back home on a cold Wednesday night. So I like that about the FA Cup. And I think that if we have a fixture congestion, the FA Cup is not the thing to tweak with necessarily. What you might explore is potentially a format tweak to the FA Cup in some capacity that allows alleviation for some of the bigger clubs. I don't know whether there's a way that you can play around with the numbering, so those in Europe only have to enter in the fourth round rather than the third round, or whether you could have a round robin stage into a knockout tournament. But again, all these things can create more fixtures for those outside of Europe and less fixtures for those in Europe, which means that on the balance of impact to a Premier League season, you're always going to get certain clubs that feel that they are hard done by. So my sense when decisions are made is that the primary consideration should be what is best for the pyramid, because this is an FA sanctioned tournament. So we have to look at how the money from something like the FA Cup is going to benefit all clubs, rather than what can we do to still get buy-in from the bigger clubs in Europe to continue wanting to play and take something like the FA Cup or the League Cup seriously. Because then what you're doing is you're bowing to a handful of teams and you're once again giving that monopoly to the bigger clubs, because they're saying, we're only going to participate in this, or we only want to play in this, or we only want to take this seriously with our top players if you do it our way. And that's not how something as magical and as equality driven as the FA Cup should be carried out. What we should be thinking about is how can we either get maximum exposure from games with maximum drama, with maximum eyeballs on them. And as I say, is it a round robin format potentially to the tournament, particularly through qualifying all the way to the third round? And then from there, do you then have a knockout tournament? And there'd be outrage, I'm sure. There'll be people that say that that is a bit like the Johnson Paint Trophy and nobody wants a round robin. But if championship clubs and lower had round robin, I think a lot of those teams would like that opportunity to play 3 games. Because if you're a non-league club, it's money in your pocket. It's a chance to have away days. And then from that point onwards, it would be a standard drawn FA Cup style tournament, which would have one less game for some of the bigger clubs, but then you still have the replays. That's one option, but a lot of people will be listening and saying that's nonsense, that's rubbish. So there is this balance between fixture congestion and financially what benefits all of the clubs. But one thing I think that we can't be doing is just making decisions based solely on what benefits the bigger clubs, especially around things like scrapping a replay. Because if you're Newcastle and if you're Man City, then you shouldn't be caring about a third round, fourth round replay. Because unless you get a horrific draw, which still statistically is unlikely, you should be winning your third round game, home or away. And if you're not winning it because you're playing a load of kids, then get rid of the chance of having a replay by playing your strongest 11 and take the tournament seriously. And if you need the replay, that's on you. That's not on the format. And this is what always makes me chuckle about managers in the third round and the fourth round. They draw a game, they get a replay, they moan and they say, wow, why are we playing this? Well, you're playing it because it's one of the oldest tournaments in the world. It's magical. And you didn't get the job done first time around. And then if you're moaning about the replay, that's on you. That's not on the format of the tournament, in my opinion. And I just think that it's a bit underwhelming in many ways. Even with the League Cup, I find this when it just goes to penalties on the day. Play another 90 minutes. Give that minnow the opportunity to reverse the fixture, to maybe take you back to their home pitch.
And make some money. Yeah, it's the magic of the cup. That I 100% agree with you, Ben. And the magic of the cup will be lost. And I see people saying, yeah, but you get injuries like we did at Tranmere in the League Cup, etc. But look, players get injured all the time. That's that comes down to fortune during the season or misfortune during the season. But yeah, scrapping replays in the FA Cup, I'm completely against it. And yeah, I think we're both singing off the same hymn sheet. I love this question because you and I have talked many times about PIF potentially going out to interact with the media, and I've just retweeted Pete Graves. There's an event going to happen in the end of October. David Ginola and Pete Graves at the Hilton in Gateshead, and Mirdad and Amanda are going to be there. So I gather they're going as guests as opposed to maybe he's being interviewed. I'm sure they'll probably get up and say something on the mic. But we've seen Amanda, we've seen Mirdad, we've seen Jamie, all been very public. 2 of the 3 have social media accounts, which we've spoken about many times. But you've always pushed on this show and said, be great to hear from PIF. Be nice to hear from them. Come out and say something. So, answer Mr. Anderson's question, I guess, Ben. Have you ever thought about trying to get an interview, or have you tried to get an interview with the people at PIF?
Yeah, I mean, many times, like a lot of journalists, the requests get put in, they get amicably declined, not because PIF say they don't want to speak, and particularly Yasser Al-Rumian, but more the timing isn't right. And a lot of majority owners are the same. They don't do a great deal of press, but I think that every group is different. And Newcastle pushed around transparency in the build-up to the acquisition of the football club. And suddenly the fans and the media haven't heard from the majority owner, at least on record. And I think that should change. And of course, from a selfish point of view, I'd like to do an interview, but what I would say to those listening who perhaps say they don't owe the media anything is I agree with you, but what they do owe is the football club something. And Mirdad and Amanda have been great ambassadors. And it is fair to say at times they are talking on behalf of both themselves, the football club and PIF. But there are certain questions that the fan base may want to ask, or certainly journalists do, that they will not know the answers to. And that is where Yasser Al-Rumian has a responsibility, in my opinion, to come before either the fan base or the media and show that this transparent mantle that Newcastle had in the build-up to the takeover is legitimate. And how he or PIF chooses to do it is ultimately entirely up to them. So as a journalist, I never play the self-entitled card. I don't think it's fair to ask for an interview to not get one. and then to throw your toys out the pram and use that as an excuse to attack the football club. I fully understand why PIF at the moment haven't done any media, and they don't want to get dragged into some of the wider issues that they'll be questioned on. And whether we as journalists think that we're entitled to ask about those or not is ultimately a point of division. And if you are conducting an interview in relation to Newcastle United Football Club, then if asked about wider issues, they may not get answered. But this is the sort of challenge, again, that the less you talk, the more when you do talk, you'll be asked on a wide array of topics. And then the more you talk, the more entitled you are to say, well, we have an open dialogue, so why are you asking me on this? It's not the time or the place. I'm talking to you as a Newcastle United chairman, not on behalf of PIF as a business, not on behalf of the Saudi Arabian government or so on. So this is the sort of irony of the situation, that the longer they leave it, the more they're going to get grilled on everything. And it wouldn't be the first time, by the way, that I've interviewed Yasser. I was over in Saudi Arabia on a number of occasions when the Saudi Golf Federation was not launched, but was putting on an event in relation to the launch of a golf event out there on behalf or in affiliation with the PGA Tour. And Yasser, because he was such a close aide to MBS, was asked about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And he was very able to provide an answer and speak of how the Saudi Arabian government would be looking into it and would be ensuring justice. And whether people believed him or not, there was a very clear media-trained answer there. And a number of my colleagues pressed him on that particular topic. So he is capable of providing an answer. He is capable of debating an issue. He is capable of giving a Saudi Arabian perspective. And I understand and I appreciate and I respect that he may not want to do that with his Newcastle United hat on. But if you take that politics out of the equation, if the Newcastle fan base or the media were in front of Yasser now, we still all want to know, was it piracy, or was it the court cases, or was it something else that got the takeover resolved? Did PIF intervene, as I've always understood that they did? And actually PIF held direct talks with Nasser Al-Khalifi at BN Sports, and then suddenly the takeover was on. What is their plan in terms of long-term vision? And how does it fit into Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030? Are Newcastle United going to be going over to Saudi Arabia regularly? Are they going to play the Saudi Arabian national team in a friendly? When is the shirt sponsor going to change? And is it going to be a Saudi Arabian partner? What is the business thinking behind the Noor sponsorship? And are we going to see more of it? How are Newcastle United going to stay within financial fair play? What are they going to spend? What are PIF capable of spending? Are we going to see any other board changes going forwards and so on? All of these things, I think, Newcastle United fans want to hear. Now, can they hear them from Mehrdad and Amanda, who have been very vocal, who have been very transparent, who, to their credit, have engaged with media at all levels? Absolutely. And some of the answers Amanda and Mehrdad will know, but some of them they won't. So I think that part of me says there's plenty of Premier League owners out there, like the Glazers, like at Man City, that don't come in front of the media. So why should PIF be any different? And I respect that opinion. And then part of me says, because of the nature of the takeover and how transparent Newcastle said they were going to be, Yasser does now have a responsibility to, at worst, directly engage with supporter groups and at best talk to the media as well. So I would love an interview. If I was given one, my line of questioning would be expansive but fair.
Can you give us a question? Because Son of THC has asked, I know you often read the chat. So he says, can we have an example of one of the questions Ben is talking about? He wants to ask that he'd like to ask the owners that Amanda and Mehrdad can't answer, please. One of the ones he sees as a toughie. Well,
I think the first thing is just to Yasser, how can he guarantee that there is complete separation between PIF at Newcastle's ownership group? Or can he outline the legal separation that PIF believed in when they first thought the takeover would happen a lot quicker? And furthermore, if there becomes a situation where the Premier League no longer believe that there is separation, what are the repercussions? And I think that only Yasser and PIF will be able to answer the first part of that question. And realistically, only Yasser and PIF will know about the dialogue that took place directly between themselves and the Premier League, and themselves and Nasser Al Khalifi and Bein. So that's kind of one question. And now a bit of time has passed. There's really no reason not to provide that information. It's not a negative against PIF. They got their takeover, but we'd all love to know definitively what happened. And I believe that Yasser Al-Rumayyan is better placed to answer that. Then I think this whole notion of sport in Saudi and how it fits into Vision 2030 is also very interesting, because the amount of times that we as journalists get, well, why are you talking about Newcastle and Saudi Arabia and not boxing in Saudi Arabia and not live golf in Saudi Arabia and so on? And again, we're not as journalists targeting one or the other. We're trying to piece together the bigger picture and how it all ties together. And Yasser Al-Rumayyan is involved in live golf and involved in Newcastle, so he can talk broadly about Saudi's strategy for sport around 2030 and also answer any questions on sports washing. And it's an opportunity for him to talk about the bigger picture in a positive way, but also acknowledge how sport may be being used for sports washing at the same time. And I think that Amanda and Mehrdad can't do that, and Yasser can. And then I think that financially speaking, it's only fair to put what is Newcastle's spending power, and does PIF have a wider multi-club model? Because we all know that they're always linked with Inter, they're linked very loosely with Marseille. So is Newcastle the only club that they're going to buy? And Newcastle United fans, I think, will want to know this as well. It's, let's say in 5 years, if Newcastle is still 10th in the Premier League, then do PIF want a club that is a regular Champions League team? And where do Newcastle fall in the pyramid? Or is the expectation that Newcastle is built to be a Champions League club, and then anything else, if PIF buy, comes under Newcastle United in the model? And I think that if Amanda and Mehrdad are to stay Newcastle-centric, that doesn't mean that PIF will. So if success doesn't come quickly for Newcastle and Inter becomes available, or any club really in another major league, do they buy a club that's bigger in terms of their actual success right now than Newcastle? And I think that worries Newcastle United fans if tomorrow, or if you flash forwards in 5 years, and Newcastle still aren't in European football, and then out the blue, they buy Inter, who, let's just say for the point of the hypothetical, have had 5 years of getting to the knockout stage of the Champions League and winning a Scudetto. Are Newcastle fans in favour of that? And are PIF quite prepared to build a model where Newcastle are not statistically the top club at that point? And I'm sure that will divide the fan base. Some will be listening and saying, yeah, it's no problem. And others will be saying, yikes, we don't like that approach. And again, I think that only Yasser and PIF can answer that, because they're speaking on behalf of the group and the strategy around sport that is bigger than Newcastle, whereas Amanda and Mehrdad are only talking on behalf of Newcastle when answering a question like that. So of course they're going to dismiss any links. So these are the kind of things that I would be asking very fairly, very openly, and I would expect informed answers. I would expect fair and positive answers. So it's not about trying to catch out Yasser or PIF. It's about trying to better understand them. And I would have a responsibility as a journalist to be fair in my line of questioning. And if I'm provided with in-depth and insightful answers, then I respect that. And then I think it benefits all sides, really, because once he's addressed that and answered those questions, if journalists like myself continue to hound, continue to speculate, continue to push, continue to agenda bash, then PIF or Newcastle can turn around and say, well, we gave you those answers. We provided you with that interview. We gave you the context. We've said our piece. But obviously, if they stay silent, then at that point, the media will continue to speculate, continue to attack, continue to go around them to different sources to try and work out what the plans are. And then I don't think anyone benefits.
Great stuff. Great answer as always. The hour is never quite enough, but we've reached the end, folks. Just want to give a quick push to the October half-term soccer school that Peter Beardsley is running Monday the 24th to Friday the 28th, 10 till 3, Fox Hunters Pavilion, North Shields, ages 8 to 16. Girls and boys welcome. Book at peterbeirdsley.soccerschool.com. And another day for your diary, October the 14th, which is a Friday night, 7 o'clock. And Newcastle Legends will take on Manchester United Legends. And this is a charity match at Fox Hunters Pavilion in North Shields. Celebrity guests, it's a charity match. There's going to be former players involved from both clubs, and that is in aid of Newcastle Fans Food Bank. So more details on that to come. NUFCmatters.com is the place to go for tickets for that one. Ben, just a quick name check to where people can find your work, mate.
Yep. Jacobs Ben, or Ben David Jacobs on Instagram, cbssports.com for the written stuff. And obviously, if you're listening in America, we've got a kind of Sky Sports News, which is CBS Sports HQ, where I will make appearances around breaking news as well. So keep across the socials, keep across the CBS website, and hopefully have some positive Newcastle transfer news to come over the coming weeks and months.
Fantastic, Ben. Thanks for giving up your time as always. I hope everybody enjoyed today's show. Don't forget, we did a show earlier with Ross Gregory as well, so plenty of content for you to watch tonight. If you've missed one, then get on that now. And I'll be back tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, with Geordie's here, Geordie's there. Until then, take care. See you soon. Bye, Ben.
Have a good week.